Well, welcome and thank you for coming tonight so we can have Craig Smith talk about the book that he's written. And I have read it, and I think it's an amazing book, and it's an amazing story. Would you please help me welcome Craig Smith?
Thank you, General Myatt, and thank you all for coming. The situation regarding Japan. So Japan in the before Admiral Perry's visit, of course, as everyone probably remembers, was a very closed society. After Perry came with his modern American naval vessels, the Japanese realized that if they were going to compete in this world, they had to improve the technology, open up. And one of their first openings was to the British, and they asked the British to build them some advanced warships, some destroyers. And from that, then they began to rapidly develop and improve the Japanese Navy. And of course, that came to fruition in 1905 when Japan surprisingly defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. At that time, the Japanese had some Russian POWs, and they were all treated in a very gentlemanly manner, if I may say that, in the sort of best samurai traditions, and eventually returned to Russia. But in the ensuing 2 decades, that all changed. Japan failed to sign the Geneva Accords regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. And also, the Army, as it expanded, the level of training of recruits, the educational level of recruits went down. And at the start of the war, Prime Minister Tojo issued an edict saying that it was dishonorable to surrender, death was preferable to surrender. And this permeated not only the Japanese military, their treatment of each other, but how they viewed the prisoners. So to their minds, the prisoners they had were people who were less than honorable because they had surrendered. So this had a big effect on the treatment of our hostages and prisoners. Right after Pearl Harbor, Japan had succeeded in conquering a vast area of the Pacific, as you can see in this chart, an area significantly larger than the continental United States. And in the middle of that, the islands here of Guam and the Marianas and the Philippines is the area that I want to talk about. In my book, I tell the stories, as General Myatt mentioned, of 6 prisoners of war. 3 were prisoners of the Japanese and 3 prisoners of the Americans. The first 2 that I will just mention briefly are Simon and Lydia. Simon is here, Simon and his wife. Simon was a civilian. He was a Russian immigrant living in the Philippines, married to Lydia. Theirs is a fascinating love story, how they came together and ended up living in this house in the Philippine jungle, where they were eventually taken captive by the Japanese, put in separate camps, eventually got out and got reunited and lived in the jungle, barely surviving till the Americans came home. Next is Mitzi Takahashi. So my pointer's not working here. She was an American, born in Santa Monica, went to Santa Monica schools, American citizen, and along with her family and other Japanese Americans at that time, in April 1942, was one of 110,000 Japanese that were interned in 10 different camps around primarily the western states. And then next is Kazuo Sakamaki, shown right here. Sakamaki was the one surviving Japanese naval man who was on one of the 5 midget submarines that tried to penetrate Pearl Harbor the night before the bombers came. All the submarines were lost. All the crewmen died, with the one exception of Sakamaki, who drifted ashore on the beach in Hawaii and was taken prisoner by the shore patrol, and he ended up spending the war 4 years in in 3 different prison camps in the United States. A totally different story from Garth Dunn. And so Garth is the first person that I want to talk about. And Garth was a young Marine, as I indicated in my opening remarks. He enlisted when he was 18 and got sent to Guam. And he was a part of the Guam police force. And at that time, Guam was this idyllic island in what you might think of like Hawaii 50 years earlier, very calm, peaceful, nothing much going on. About the biggest thing that they did was on Saturday night, if they were on a patrol, they might arrest a few drunken Chamorros, the local population, and put them in jail, and they'd release them the next morning when they sobered up. Well, that all changed with Pearl Harbor because the Japanese bombed Guam the same day they bombed Pearl Harbor, and of course they bombed the Philippines. And several days later, as I indicated, they came roaring in and captured the island. And that was the first bit of American territory that was taken by Japan. This is a photo of the governor's palace in Guam, and it was at the back of that palace where Garth was with one other Marine was stationed. That was his defensive position, armed with his .45 caliber automatic when the Japanese invaded. I went back to Guam. I decided I wanted to try to see all these places where the prisoners had been and try to put myself in the physical situation that they had been in to try to better understand their thinking and what it was like. So this is the wall surrounding the governor's palace where the troops took up position behind that wall. As I said, I went back to Guam, and in all the islands in the South Pacific, you can see lots of relics from the war. When you visit these places and you see all this stuff that's left behind, you get a picture of what a vast conflict it was. One of the problems the Japanese had was that they were overwhelmed by their victories. They had hundreds of thousands of American and Asian and European prisoners and no place to put them initially. So they started constructing a lot of camps. You can see here some of the, this isn't all of them, this shows you the number of camps. And most of the camps where the American and Europeans came to, they were used as laborers to replace the manpower that the Japanese were putting into the armed forces. And then there was the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was only 120 miles from the Hirohata camp, so the prisoners there knew right away something really major had happened. And a few days later, their work was interrupted, and they were taken back to the camp in the middle of the day. One of the prisoners was joking with another, and he said, well, you know, maybe the war is over. And the lieutenant lined him up out in front of the camp gates and said, the war is over, America has won, we are ordered to paint PW on top of the barracks. So the prisoners stood there for a few minutes in shock. Then all of a sudden they broke ranks, they ran through the gates, they smashed open the storerooms, they cooked up huge kettles of rice, and they all got sick. So they were stuck there for a couple of weeks. They painted PW on the roofs of the camps, as you can see here, and eventually Navy flyers came over and started parachuting supplies, food, and clothing and stuff, and then they were eventually brought home. Some interesting shots from the plane dropping the parachutes. And at the time of the Japanese surrender, or the formal surrender, when it took place, they were still in the camp, and they raised this homemade flag to celebrate the final victory. So Garth came home, married his high school sweetheart, and went back to college at USC, and struggled to get back in the learning habits after 4 years or 6 years away from it, and then had a long, successful career in marketing. Simon and Lydia Peters immigrated to the U.S., and he eventually went to work right down the street from here at PG&E, which is where I first got to know him. The Yoshinagas got married in the Manzanar camp, and went out after the war was over and struggled, but eventually rebuilt their lives. The question was a comparison with treatment between what the Japanese did and the Vietnamese. I think there was a lot of things, a lot of similarities. The Vietnamese were very brutal. There was a difference in their philosophy. I think they didn't have the to surrender is dishonorable concept that was so permeated the Japanese thinking. There was a lot more mental abuse, I think, with the Vietnamese in terms of what they did to prisoners, holding them in isolation, trying to get them to go on public media and repudiate the war and all of that sort of thing. Certainly what they did was very, 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 very bad. The other difference was they did not put our prisoners to work. The Japanese had manpower shortages, so they really worked people, and they viewed them as expendable.
I do recommend you buy the book and read it. It's very readable. And the way that you showed each of these folks who were prisoners of this war, the Second World War, at different points in time, I thought was amazing. And I really enjoyed that. It's very readable. In fact, I hope you have a good bit of time once you start reading, because you won't want to put it down. And they're available here. And I know that Craig will sit here and sign it for you if you get one. And for the rest of you, have a glass of wine and we'll just talk about the book. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much.